Oh, yes. Testing, is that good? Okay. Thank you, Carrie, for reminding me. I printed up a little resource guide as well. Those are on the little podium thing on the other side of this pillar here. So on your way out, feel free to grab one of those. It's a list of some books that might be helpful for you, as well as some websites. So feel free to grab that either now or when you are on your way out. All right. So now we are moving on to the New Testament. This is going to be much more familiar ground for a lot of folks. The Old Testament is enormous and is also sometimes less easy to read, both for sort of like, again, the reprehensible things that are in it, but also just it's very sort of arcane, has lots of lists of people and how many are in what tribe and whatever, and so this is going to be much more familiar. It's also going to be a lot more familiar just because the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, reflects an older worldview and a more Eastern worldview, whereas the New Testament is something that is it's based in a Greco-Roman world, which has a lot of is sort of the philosophical ancestry of a lot of our culture is in those worlds. So, as far as the context of the New Testament, there's a couple of important things to understand about it. And the very first one is the Pax Romana. So, as I mentioned with the Hebrew Bible, empire is exceedingly important when it comes to understanding the Bible, because the people who wrote what is now our Bible usually lived under the boot of some foreign empire that conquered them. And for the New Testament, the entirety of the New Testament, that was the Roman Empire. Pax Romana is a term, it means Roman peace, and it is a little bit of a sort of an ironic term, because what it actually represents is global domination and the absence of conflict through that domination. And so when we talk about Rome, we are talking about an authoritarian dictatorship, and there is a lot of brutality involved in what we would understand as the Roman peace. But it is also the context that allowed for a lot of what is now our culture to emerge and to flourish, and a big part of that is Christianity. Now, an important part of understanding the rise of Christianity is understanding what Judaism looked like in those times. Again, this is a conversation about sex, but we're going to be talking about sex. It was a terrible joke. But in order to understand how Christianity sort of rose to prominence in its time, you have to understand that there was a lot of folks within Judaism that had different ideas about what it meant to be Jewish, particularly when it came to being Jewish in a Greco-Roman society. And so there were some versions of that faith system that were all about assimilating into Greco-Roman society, whereas others were about sort of like radically resisting to the point of sort of like violence and even what we might call sort of like terrorist acts, the murder of random civilians as a way of inciting chaos. And so within this movement, one of the sects that emerged was Christianity. And because for a lot of these movements that were centered around this idea that God would soon deliver the Jewish people from domination, behind a lot of that was this idea of a Messiah, which is an idea that first begins to appear within the Hebrew Bible, but really gets articulated in the period in between the Old and New Testaments, as we would say it. And so there were lots of Messiah movements that happened in the years around when Jesus lived on this planet. And a lot of them were sort of like more outright rebellions, and they were quashed and their leaders were crucified. What makes Jesus different is that, as far as we can tell, he never advocated any kind of violence. That kind of is his whole thing, this piece. And what's interesting is the way in which the Jesus movement emerged, despite sort of not being a revolutionary movement in a more literal sense, but also in the way that it continued after the execution of its leader. And there's sort of a lot of ways you could explain that. I would say many Christians would explain it in terms of the resurrection of Jesus. And so an important part of this, the idea that Jesus was a Messiah, is the idea that Jesus' followers believed that the end of the world was on its way very soon. They believed that, when he was still living, many of his followers believed that sort of the triumphant apocalyptic action that God was going to take through Jesus would happen in their lifetime, and they did not anticipate him being crucified. So then as the religious movement continued, after his crucifixion, they began to have to reconcile with this idea that, okay, well, we said Jesus is coming back, and he's not coming back. And so within the New Testament, as we talked about in the Hebrew Bible, we have a gradual change in certain priorities and certain theological agendas. And so the oldest parts of the New Testament reflect the idea that Jesus is going to return within a century. That is expressed by some of the phrases that we see in the Gospels and by some of the earliest letters of Paul. The later parts of the New Testament reflect the realization that, okay, Jesus might not be coming back in our lifetime, so we have to figure out how to exist as people who aren't sort of on our way out. And so to that end, the last kind of pillar in understanding the context of the New Testament in the early church is that the transition from messianic movement to religious institution is one that we can sort of trace through the New Testament, but that really the canonization, the sort of like the closing of the book on what counts as the New Testament marks some of the closure of this idea of church as an institution rather than simply the Jesus movement. And so I think it's important to understand that what is reflected in our New Testament is people who are still very much negotiating a new identity and negotiating a new way of living, particularly when it comes to folks who are reinterpreting their ancestral Jewish tradition versus folks who were not Jewish but who found some level of connection to the Jesus movement. So, when it comes to the text in the New Testament, St. Paul, Paul the Apostle, is probably the most important figure. I have him listed here as Christianity's founder, and you might say, wait, thought that was Jesus. But the thing is, Jesus never expressed a desire to establish a religion. That's something that happened later. And the reason that I would say that Paul is Christianity's founder is because he's responsible for writing most of the New Testament. And he's responsible for some of the biggest ideas that became Christian doctrine that have been ensconced for generations. Something that is interesting about Paul is that there are 13, or depending on who you ask, 14 books of the 27 New Testament books that are attributed to him. Scholars believe that he only actually wrote 7 of those. And so there is a difference within the New Testament between authentic Paul and what we would call Deutero-Paul, which just means second Paul. I'm trying to say this diplomatically. The way that we would understand a person writing in another's name as though they were writing is different for us today than it was for them. It was not considered sort of deception for a person to write as someone they were not, because it was believed that they were sort of a disciple of that person, and they were a representative of that person. And so what we have in the New Testament is a lot of folks who are writing as sort of a representative of Paul, or a representative of Peter, who actually lived after both of those people had died. But we do have some, in fact we have 7, like I said, 7 books that most scholars are certain were written by Paul the Apostle. We are limited in what we can know about Paul as a human being, but we do know that he was well educated. He grew up in the city of Tarsus, which was in what we now call Turkey, which means that it was on the boundary between Europe and Asia. And so he was well educated in multiple senses. He was well educated in the Torah, in the ancestral traditions of his people. He also was incredibly well educated in Greco-Roman philosophy, particularly Stoicism. The city of Tarsus was what was called a university city. Before sort of a university as an institution was created, this was a place where scholars and tutors from around the world could come, and Paul could sort of absorb that knowledge, and it shows up in the way that he writes. He is a master of rhetoric and a master of all the sort of intellectual arts of his day. And so when it comes to Paul's authentic letters, there are 2 passages that come from those letters that are used against LGBTQ people. And I think we need to address these in very different ways. And so the first one comes from Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, which is a city in Greece. And let me track that down real quick. 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10 says, "Do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, robbers, none of these will inherit the kingdom of God." And so when we are talking about this passage in particular, one second. Got a little lost. We're talking about this passage in particular. It's important that this is one of those examples of what I referred to earlier when I said that there are certain interpretations that are just based on bad data. Because within this text, there's a couple of words in Greek that get translated many different ways. So I don't know how well you can read that, so I'm just going to go ahead and read it aloud. In King James, so the 2 Greek words are arsenokoitai and malakoi. So in KJV, that's abusers of themselves with mankind and effeminate. The NIV consolidates those 2 terms into men who have sex with men. The NRSV, the version I just read, male prostitutes and sodomites. The New King James Version is homosexuals and sodomites. The ESV, again, consolidates the 2 terms into men who practice homosexuality. And again, the Common English Bible, both participants in same-sex intercourse. The problem with that is that's not what those words mean. Let's go ahead and take them one at a time because they are very different. So essentially the argument that folks will make is that these words refer to, and this might be a bit blue for folks, refer to tops and bottoms. Refer to, again, as the CEB would say, 2 participants in male same-sex relationships. Arsenokoitai is a word that only appears twice in the Bible, and both times it appears in what we call a vice list, which is like that list I just read off, of just like a rapid-fire list of bad people. And it comes from the words arsen, which means male, and koitai, which means bed. And so sort of the natural inclination that folks have when translating it is to say, oh, it's referring to a man, because obviously the assumed audience is a man. So it's someone who beds a man. So they're like, there you go, now you know what it is. The problem with that is that words don't always mean what their etymology is. What when I say that I have a navigation system in my car, I don't mean that my car can sail, even though that's what navigation literally means in Latin, is sailing. And so using etymology to sort of like predetermine what a word means is a mistake. Because in extra biblical sources outside the Bible, arsenic gets used in a lot of contexts where it simply cannot mean men who have sex with men. The most obvious example being with a church father who refers to a man who commits arsenokoitai with his wife. Scholars and readers of this text have offered many theories for what this means. The most sort of prominent one is that it just means anal sex, which again, if that's what this is forbidding, that is not specific to gay people. It's not specific to gay men. It is not sexual orientation specific. But as I mentioned, there's another use of this word in the Bible, and it is in 1 Timothy. Let me find the exact reference one. 1 Timothy 1, 9 through 10. That is, now we know the law is good if one uses it legitimately. This means understanding that the law is laid down not for the innocent, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the godless and sinful, for the unholy and profane, for those who kill their father or mother, for murderers, fornicators, sodomites, slave traders, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching. So when it comes to vice lists, they are organized thematically. And so the positioning of this word arsenokoitai next to slave trader in this text gives us a bit of a hint about what it might actually mean. Within the Greco-Roman world, what we would call homosexuality or same-sex intimacy was not the same thing that what we would understand it to be today. Because within the Greco-Roman world, there is a strict value system of masculinity, of honor and shame. The idea of gender in the Greco-Roman world was that at the very top, you had landowning, free, citizen, able-bodied, adult, male. And then you would go down the sort of the pyramid in the hierarchy on any of those axes. And so Roman society was very hierarchical in the way it was structured. There were enslaved people who were submissive to their masters. There were children submissive to their parents, wives submissive to their husbands, women submissive to men in general, foreigners submissive to citizens. And within that system, it was acceptable to have same-sex intimacy as long as the dynamics of that imitated heterosexual or heteronormative relationships. And so the idea being that a free citizen man could have as much sex as he wanted with an enslaved boy because he was higher in rank than him, but he had to be in sort of what you would call an active role in that. And so what arsenokoitai is communicating is not this idea of a person having consensual gay sex. It is a person who is taking advantage of another, who is living out that sort of hierarchical role of being more manly, more masculine, more on top of the hierarchy than the other person. And so the other side of that coin is this word malakoi, which is just the plural of the word malakos. Malakos is just the Greek word for soft. And it became sort of almost what you would call a slur for referring to an effeminate person. That's why some of these translations have them being feminine. But again, it's important to understand that within that system, the word for the idea of being effeminate meant being less morally capable, because the idea was that women were less morally capable. The idea was that men, and free, sort of like citizen men, were the ideal human being, and deviations from that were deviations from that ideal. And so for a man to act womanish is for a man to be immoral. And so when we see this term show up, what we have to ask is, what is Paul thinking when he's writing that? Is he understanding these terms within his broader context, or is he turning them on its head? And so part of what I wanted to get at with these two words is when you are listing off a list of sort of bad people, it makes much more sense to me for you to say that it is wrong for you to take advantage of someone. It is wrong for you to exploit someone. And when it comes to the use of the word malakoi, I think that is a reflection of Paul's own cultural limitations. I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this. It's like if you've ever had someone who communicates a good idea using insensitive language, if that makes any sense. So that's kind of the way I perceive it, is that Paul's not a feminist. He's not critical of the fact that he exists in a patriarchal culture. And so he is not going to think about the fact that, like, the word that he's using to say sort of morally weak-willed is actually kind of a misogynist thing to say. And even the reason that I pointed out vice and virtue is that word virtue contains the Latin word for man. That's how ingrained in Greco-Roman society the idea was. Is that the idea of moral fortitude was synonymous with manliness. And so whether Paul is fully buying into this or simply sort of carelessly using a linguistic convention, it's hard to say. But what I don't think is being represented here is what you would call sort of a consensual sexual relationship. So now let's move on to Romans. Romans 1, 18 through 32. And this is a long one, so buckle up. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. So they are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men, and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind, and to things that should not be done. They were filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious towards parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. They know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, that they not only do them, but even applaud others who practice them. So again, this is one of the harsher ones, and it's really unfortunate because, yet again, it is based in error in data. Because the fact of the matter is, that's not Paul's point of view. The book of Romans is what is called an epistolary diatribe. The word epistolary just means it's from a letter. And diatribe, you see that that word kind of connected to dialogue. And essentially the idea in an epistolary diatribe is that you embed within your letter the opposing point of view in which you are going to engage a debate. And so we actually have lots of examples of this throughout the book of Romans. So I'm just going to go through a few of them kind of rapid fire. Romans 6. Shall we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? By no means. Romans 6 again. Should we sin because we are not under law but under grace? By no means. What then should we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Did what is good then bring death to me? By no means. What then are we to say? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means. So I ask, have they stumbled as to fall? By no means. So I think what is most important to understand about the book of Romans is that it is a letter written to a people trying to make sense of, again, like I mentioned before, the intersection of Jewish identity and this new Christian movement that includes Gentiles as well. So the interlocutor, that imaginary debate partner that is embedded within the text, is coming at this from a very harsh and a very judgmental standpoint. And Paul, throughout the book of Romans, is trying to make an argument not only for this idea of grace through faith, that is sort of the central theme of the book of Romans, but also for the idea that the way that Gentiles belong to the Christian faith is different from the way that Jewish people belong to their ancestral faith, but that it is no less valid. And so when people quote that passage as though Paul is saying this, as though this is the point of what Paul is saying, it feels very silly to me because immediately after that passage, and chapters were not a part of the original letter, and so this would have been there would be no break in the text here like it is in English. He says, therefore you have no excuse. What's written here is whoever you are. In Greek, that literally just says, oh man, when you judge others. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, are doing the very same things. So that's a clue in Greek that we are making the transition from the, as I had before, the blue text to the red text, which is Paul. And I think going back and reading through it, it's helpful to kind of change the tone of your voice when you read it. And so if you kind of give yourself a supercilious kind of demeanor and feel like you're better than people and say, they were filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They're gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious towards parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. It begins to become clear that Paul is sort of representing a straw man, essentially, for him to argue with. And what he's doing here is actually imitating sort of common criticisms from Jewish intellectuals of Gentiles in general. In particular, Gentile rulers who were known for sort of like their lasciviousness and self-indulgence. And so what Paul is doing here is saying, you don't have the right to judge. And so it is very ironic to me that that is exactly what happens with this text, when what is actually being embedded here is sort of the exact opposite. Another really important aspect of that particular text and the way that it fits into the entire argument of Romans, because Romans is sort of like internally cohesive. Like I said, Paul is a master of rhetoric, and so he has crafted this. Within the discussion of their sexual behavior, there is this idea of it being unnatural. So the word there in Greek is kataphusin, means contrary to nature. The traditional line of thinking when it comes to that is like, oh, of course, human beings are like puzzle pieces. We fit together. You can't put two, female ends of a cable together, whatever you want to say. What's interesting is that the way Paul uses nature actually is more the way that we would say culture. When he talks about their women exchange natural sexual relations for that which is unnatural, it's important to note that though many people will say this is the only part of the Bible that mentions lesbians, it doesn't say women and women. It just says women doing what is unnatural. It says men with men, but the list of things that a woman could do to be considered sexually unnatural was much bigger because higher scrutiny of women, as has been the story since time immemorial. And so for a woman to even act in a way that was sort of, that did not properly reflect that her husband was in charge of her in their sexual relationship would be perceived as unnatural. But what is interesting about that phrase, again, is that in Romans 11, that is the exact phrase that Paul uses to talk about Gentiles becoming Christians. He says that it's like a branch of a wild olive tree that has been grafted onto a cultivated olive tree, contrary to nature. And he is saying that's a good thing. So again, he's a master of rhetoric. And so within his example of this judgmental interlocutor, he uses this phrase against nature, and then he flips it on its head because he's saying you don't get to judge what God is doing here. And I think that people just completely miss that, especially when you take verses out of context and don't see them in conversation with a larger part. So, our next portion, I'm going to read sort of 3 different texts all in a row, and you might not immediately see how they connect to one another, but I think they all fit the same kind of conversation. So the first one is going to be Ephesians 5. Ephesians 5, 22 through 24. These New Testament epistles, you blink and you miss it. Wives, be subject to your husbands as you are to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is head of the church, the body of which he is the Savior. Just as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives ought to be in everything to their husbands. And this is also something that's repeated in the book of Colossians, pretty much in the same format. It's part of a larger body of text that is called Household Codes. Also includes instructions for children to obey their parents and for slaves to obey their masters. That's a very sort of important aspect that doesn't get talked. Again, when it comes to the division of chapters, Ephesians 5 contains the instructions of husbands and wives, which people like to use for gender essentialist purposes. But there's a chapter split that separates that from the conversation about slaves and masters, which people tend to try to ignore. So it's interesting that within the text they are put together, but the way that they have been transmitted to us has been separated. I did these out of order. My bad. They all fit together. Another one is Matthew 19. And that's Matthew 19. What was it? Just Matthew 19, 3 through 12. Some Pharisees came to him, and to test him they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command us to give a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her?" He said to them, "It was because you were so hard-hearted that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for unchastity, and marries another, commits adultery." His disciples said to him, "If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry." But he said to them, "Not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can." And then the last in this trio comes from 1 Timothy chapter 2. Verses 11 and 15. "Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man, she is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. So, at first glance, it might not seem that the two letters in particular are related to what Jesus has to say there in the book of Matthew. But the thing that unifies them is that destroying the traditional family, a Christian value since AD 30. So as I mentioned before, throughout the course of the New Testament, we have a change in people's expectations vis-a-vis the apocalypse. And the earlier passages, the ones written actually by Paul, reflect this idea that Christ's return is imminent. The later ones have to find a way to live within a Roman world. As I mentioned, the Roman world is extremely patriarchal, extremely hierarchical. Some archaeologists and anthropologists have actually argued that Rome was more patriarchal than some of the sort of like older civilizations, which, generally we might have this notion that things are getting better over time, but what really happens is there are cycles, and different cultures have different values through time. And Rome, basically, when you're ruled by an emperor, you have to create this idea that everyone needs to have a boss. And so Rome is incredibly hierarchical. And within the family in particular, that shows up in something called the patria potestas, and that means the power of the father. Within Roman law, a male householder, a father, could literally do anything he wanted to his children. He had the legal right to kill them without any question. That is how absolute the power of the father was in Roman society. There's an example of a man who kills his wife for getting drunk, and his neighbors all celebrate him for doing it. It was an extremely patriarchal culture, and again, it reflected some of the values of the patriarchy that we talked about in the Hebrew Bible. It is important to preserve your lineage, and so marriage in the Roman Empire was a very political thing. The Romans were monogamous because marriage was a way of an alliance between noble houses. But within this society, there was this idea that, and you might have heard this in more modern times from places like Focus on the Family, that the family is the core unit of civilization. And so the sort of militant and violent way in which authority is enforced within the family unit was reflected throughout society. And so also within that, the idea that if you're a woman, it is your job to get married and to have kids. Women had some relative freedom when it came to being able to be involved in civic affairs and things like that, but it was still very much expected that you would get married and you would bear children. And so for the early Christians who believed that the end of the world was on its way, they believed that Jesus had ushered in a new era, they were resisting the traditional family. They started calling each other brother and sister. We have words from Jesus that say, you must hate your mother, you must hate your father to become part of what I am doing. And for that reason, the Romans saw Christianity as a subversive, anti-Roman cult. For a long time, Judaism was seen as what was called a legal religion. They didn't follow the Roman imperial religion, but they were okay with them. But when these Christians started spreading this idea that a new king was here, and his name was Jesus, and all the traditional boundaries of family and kinship and wealth were not important in this new world order, they saw that as a threat. Some of the examples of Christians who were killed in the earliest history of the church were women who rejected marriage proposals because they converted to Christianity. They said, no, I I'm not a uterus. I am a child of God. And so what's interesting is that as time goes on, leaders of the Christian church had to find ways to not be annihilated. And so some of these later texts reflect this impulse to be seen as not as threatening, this impulse to let the Romans know, wait, we're pro-family. And so that's actually where the household codes come in, is not only Christians, but other sort of minority religions in the Roman Empire produced household codes so that they could point to them and say, no, we have a system. We do have a system, it's fine. And so what's interesting when it comes to Paul in particular is that Paul is credited with both the Ephesians text and the Colossians text and the 1 Timothy, but scholars don't actually think that he wrote that. What Paul did write, however, is Galatians 3:28. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female. For you are one in Christ Jesus. Likewise, in that Matthew text that we read, which again is used to say that the marriage only counts if it's a man and a woman, people tend to skip over the part where Jesus says that if you really are committed to this, you are going to live as though you are genderless. And that is actually how many early Christians saw Jesus himself, was as genderless, because as far as we know, he never married. And that was sort of how you proved that you were a man. And so that's also interesting in terms of what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 22, verse 30. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. Again, reflecting this idea that within a new spiritual reality, the importance of gender, the importance of reproducing, of building society, just isn't as relevant in the wake of what God is doing. And so as a reflection of that, within the older parts of the New Testament, we also see a greater deal of gender equality. In the book of Romans, chapter 16, we have one woman, Junia, named as an apostle. We have another, Phoebe, named as a deacon. And we have another, Prisca, named as a pastor of a church. In contrast to that, the writing in 1 Timothy that says that a woman is not allowed to do those things. And so, again, just being conscious of the social forces that guided some of these early Christians in how they lived in the world. So, now we are on to our final thoughts. The first, and this is sort of parallel to one of the closing thoughts that we had with the Hebrew Bible in the ancient Near East. When we read the New Testament, it is more relatable to us. It is more in tune with sort of our cultural values, because they are informed by Christianity in a lot of ways. But we are still reading someone else's mail. Most of the New Testament is letters. Most of the New Testament is letters addressed to specific communities and specific people even. And so, again, to look at that and to say, this is an objective truth for all time that requires no interpretation, no adaptation, no translation, I just think that makes no sense. Another important thing, thy kingdom come. Within the Jesus tradition, there is this idea that God's kingdom is within the social realities of the day. And so what we see reflected in the New Testament is tension between what I would call apocalypticism, apocalyptic androgyny even, and sort of like assimilation to the culture that you're in. I think that the actual message of Jesus, when he talks about the kingdom of heaven, is a middle road of that. It is by no means an attempt to sort of change culture from the top down, although that is what Christianity has looked like for centuries. It is the living as though there is a new reality in the midst of the old. And so I think, again, when we say center the center, that is something that is very important. And then, of course, lastly, his law is love. Comes from one of my favorite Christmas carols, O Holy Night. And again, within the New Testament, over and over again, what we see is the most important thing is love. Love your neighbor. Within Romans itself, Romans 13:10, love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. So the grammatical structure of that sentence means that the reason that love fulfills the law is because it does no harm. And so our metric for what is love, and therefore for what is lawful, what is ethical, is what does no harm. And so when we talk about gender and sexuality, that has to be our guidepost. And so when we talk about the way in which having one affirming adult in their life decreases the risk of a queer kid committing suicide by 40%, that means more to me than any of the texts that we have delved into. And I think that is sort of the basis of creating a Christian ethics around gender and sexuality. I believe, hold on, I didn't thoroughly check at the end, so let me just double check and see if we have any further questions. It might just be one. Great, so there are two. The first one is the longer one, and I think it also relates pretty well to the earlier part of our conversation. How do we deal with the institutionalized violence and prejudice branded as Christianity, like the Crusades, Spanish Inquisition, KKK, nationalist militias, etc.? Well, this is sold under the label of Christianity, almost as a justification for unrelated violence, similar to when other religions as well are pinned as scapegoats for the actions of individuals. And the way I would answer that question is, I think we need to approach it the way that the editors and redactors of the Hebrew Bible did, which is not to absolve ourselves of it. Particularly for people who are Christian in this country, Christian privilege is a real thing. To be Christian, even to be culturally Christian, even if you never go to church, if you are culturally Christian, you enjoy a level of privilege in this country, particularly because of the way that Christianity in this country, Protestant Christianity in particular, has melded with white supremacy to be almost inseparable. And like the editors of the Hebrew Bible who left in things that were incredibly damning, I think that I see a lot of folks who will say, oh, that's not a real Christian. And I think that is a way of distancing ourselves rather than acknowledging the harm. I think that for me, as a white person and as a man and as a Christian, there are ways in which I mean, as a gay man, it would be very easy for me to say, well, I don't count as a man when you're saying, like, men enjoy privilege, men have occupied a position of violent power over non-men. And in ways that's true, but there are many ways in which it is not true. I still enjoy significant privilege as a man. And so I think that for folks who, especially for folks who seek to call themselves Christians, it is important to say, to acknowledge the darkness in our history and not to shy away from it, and to make sure that we are giving the microphone to other traditions, and make sure we are listening when people say, the church hurt me. I love this church, and I hope that nobody who goes to my church ever tells someone, oh, my church is different, when they are being told about how the church has hurt them. I hope that never happens, because we strive to be better here. We strive to be a safe place. But that does not give us permission to diminish the hurt that has been done. Even if, we didn't do it, that's true. It's like, I never owned slaves. Like, you can absolve yourself very easily of the things that have bought you privilege. but I don't think it's the ethical path forward. So hopefully that was an answer to that question. What is a brief, educated response to Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve? My initial instinct was to say a joke that is not original to me, but it's the Bible, not the straight pole, is one that I've heard. This is a hard question just because it's such a thought-terminating cliche in the first place. I guess I would have to get into what is maybe underlying that statement. What is the idea that, like we talked about, that the Genesis narrative itself is prescriptive, and in that case I would say, well, it's prescriptive and you're not a farmer, you need to get right with God. If the response is, if it's coming from sort of like what people would say is like a biological essentialism of, man and woman are intended to be together, I would say homosexuality shows up in literally thousands of species, particularly among primates, which we are, so I hope that is helpful. It is hard to come up with an educated response to an uneducated question, though. All right. Well, I really appreciate everyone for coming. I appreciate if there is anyone on YouTube. I appreciate you sticking around for technical difficulties. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? Yes.
How do we, while we recognize the harm that Christianity has done, how do we go about now in this Christian nationalist kind of crazy time that we're living in, reclaiming that as love? And how do we witness to the extravagant love of Christ and make Christianity safe for people again? Easy, simple question.
Oh yeah. I think, this is, I don't know if it works, but this is the method that I am trying, and it is being specific. It's saying, I'm a Christian, and ... And so, like, being able to say, I'm a Christian, and Christian nationalism is against my beliefs. That's a powerful statement. That's a powerful statement to make. I'm a Christian, and I believe that trans people deserve access to the healthcare they need. That's a powerful statement. What I think would be a mistake would be to just trust that you can say, I'm a Christian and I love everyone. Because lots of people say that and don't mean it and don't live like it. And so being specific is, I think, one of the only ways that we can go about doing that. And again, it also is like, it's a thing that takes time. Christianity has broken trust with people, and rebuilding trust takes time. For me, especially as a pastor, as a leader of a faith community, I have had to learn to get comfortable with the fact that it's like, part of my job is not getting everyone who's been hurt by church to the point where they're back in a church. Because I don't think that God lives in the church anyway. So I think that they can find her, and I think that she'll go where they are. All right, well, it feels appropriate to end this in a prayer, so I'll go ahead and do that. Loving God, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for curious hearts and for open minds. We pray that on this journey we are on, we will learn to think about the ways in which we exist in a world that has cultural scripts that are written for us, and think about the ways in which those scripts might hurt us or our neighbor.